So I would like to welcome everybody to this dissertation defense. And to start with, I thought that the committee could introduce itself, and then I'll give you a brief overview of what we're going to do today, and then just hand it right over to Marie to present. So I'm Craig Chalkwist. I have the honor to be chair of this dissertation committee, and I am core faculty in East-West Psychology at the California Institute of Integral Event. CIIS, California Institute of Integral. So next, Nicole, if you would introduce yourself.
Certainly. I'm Dr. Nicole Zapien. I am faculty in the Human Sexuality PhD program at the California Institute of Integral Studies, and I am also a licensed and practicing clinician. Nice to see everybody today.
And I'm Dr. Cassia Wasik, and I also have the honor of being on this committee as the external member. And so I'm actually a full-time professor down at El Camino College, and I also teach a sociology of sexualities class at UC Irvine that I started about 20 years ago when I was going to graduate school. So I've been an academic and a sex researcher doing a lot of work with non-monogamy and polyamory. And so Marie and I struck up a professional relationship a few years ago when I had a brief outing at CIIS, and so it's just been really fun working with her as an external member. So I'm excited that today is the day.
Great. So here's a little bit of an overview. Marie will have roughly 45 minutes, 50 minutes to present on her topic. And I'm going to ask all of you to just go ahead and stay muted, except for the committee, while Marie presents. And then at the end of that, the custom is for the committee to ask questions of our doctoral candidates. So the custom in East-West Psychology usually is to ask the external reader to go ahead and start off. And each committee member will be able to ask a couple of questions of the candidate. I'll go ahead and go last. And then at that point, the committee will go offline for a little bit to confer, and we'll do a conference call offline. And while we're gone, that will be your opportunity to ask Marie any questions that you have. So we will confer, and then we will come back and announce our decision. So that's what we have planned today. So with that, Marie, are you ready?
I don't have much of an option.
Too late to back out now.
Yes, I'm very ready.
Good.
Okay, so thank you so much everyone for showing up and being here. I feel so supported by my committee and by all the friends and colleagues who have taken time out of their day to be here today. Thank you so much. Yeah, it's the end of an era, and I'm so excited to present the research that I've been working on in the last few years. It's a topic that's really dear to me and that I find just fascinating. So I hope you will get a lot out of today. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and use a PowerPoint presentation to go over what I've been working on. So can everyone see the PowerPoint?
Yep.
Yes, excellent. All right. So my dissertation title is Compersion in Consensually Non-Monogamous Relationships, a Grounded Theory Investigation. So before we get really into the meat of things, I want to just define the terms that I'm going to be using throughout the presentation. So the first one is compersion. I assume that you all know what it is if you're here, but the classic definition of compersion from the literature is the feeling of taking joy in the joy that others you share among themselves, especially taking joy in the knowledge that your beloveds are expressing their love for one another. I'm going to contribute a couple more definitions from my research, but this is what compersion has been defined as so far in the literature. So feeling happy when your romantic partners enjoy their time with somebody else and not needing to be in the center of it. It's colloquially known as the opposite of jealousy, although it's not mutually exclusive with jealousy. Definitely, compersion and jealousy often do coexist in the same space and in the same relationships. The word was coined in the Carista community in the early 1990s. As with most sexual minority groups, people who are consensually non-monogamous have had to create their own language to express their experiences because the mainstream language did not reflect their experiences. So it was the case for compersion. People were experiencing it, but didn't have a word for it, so they had to make one up. Other key constructs of importance are consensual non-monogamy, which I'm abbreviating as CNM throughout the presentation. And these are the intimate relationships in which all partners explicitly agree that each partner may have romantic and/or sexual relationships with others. And that can include polyamory, open relationships, relationship anarchy, open relationships, and other denominations. So it's an umbrella term for non-monogamies where there is consent and explicit communication. How prevalent it is, it's been evaluated that about 20% of Americans have engaged in CNM at some point in their lives, and 45% of Americans are currently involved in CNM relationships, which is not a negligible portion of the population. We all probably know people who are consensually non-monogamous, whether we know it or not. And the other really important key construct is mononormativity. And that's the assumption that romantic and sexual relationships are only normal or healthy between two monogamous partners. It's very akin to heteronormativity, where that's the assumption that romantic relationships are only normal or healthy between a man and a woman. But in the context of monogamy, we use monogamy as the superior or only or healthy standard for relationships, which I think causes a lot of unnecessary suffering. And that is the core of why I decided to study compersion. So why did I decide on this topic for a multi-year research project? Part of it has to do with my personal background. I grew up in a non-traditional family structure where my parents decided to have me without wanting marriage or wanting cohabitation, and they made the conscious decision to do that. So I think that from the very beginning, I believe that relationships and family structures were something that you could create intentionally rather than just falling into a socially prescribed path. So when I encountered mononormativity for the first time, I was blown away. I remember in college an instance where I wanted to engage romantically with someone who told me, oh, I can't because I have a girlfriend. And I got confused. I was like, what does that have to do with me and you? So I remember the culture clash in that moment and wanting to know more about why mononormativity was a thing. And what I discovered is that it rests on the assumption that jealousy is the only possible response to extradyadic intimacy. So if you only think that jealousy is possible if there's extradyadic intimacy, of course you're going to think that monogamy is the only way to go. But why do we have that assumption? That rests a lot on the limits of our language. We have a lot of words to describe jealousy and monogamy, but we don't have much of a language to describe compersion. In fact, the word compersion is not yet in the main dictionaries like Oxford or Merriam-Webster. So I really felt that the word compersion, the concept, the reality of compersion is a big challenge to mononormativity and has a lot of potential for helping us loosen that paradigm and stop causing so much unnecessary suffering to folks who don't resonate with monogamy as the only way. So I dug into the research that has already been done, and there isn't a lot. We only know a few key points from existing research on compersion. What we know is that compersion is positively correlated with relationship satisfaction in CNM relationships. We know that compersion can be conceptualized as a trait or as a state. So a trait meaning more of an attitude, like we have a compersive attitude towards our lovers being with other people, but not necessarily the experience. But then the state is the actual embodied experience of compersion. Compersion is connected with enculturation into CNM mindsets. So it's easier to experience compersion when we have an ideological commitment to values and mindsets that are in line with consensual non-monogamy. And compersion is likely to have a utilitarian component. And utilitarian means that you might feel grateful for your partner's other relationship because of the benefits received through those. And I'm going to show through my research that this is true, but it's not the whole story. So what I decided to investigate are two research questions. First, what is the experience of compersion? How do people describe it? How do people experience it? Like, what's the phenomenology of the experience? And then number two, what contexts impact the experience of compersion? So in what context do people are finding themselves more likely to experience it versus less likely? My research design was a qualitative design. When we don't really know a lot about a topic, it's better to start with qualitative methods because it allows us to go deeper into a topic rather than analyzing it quantitatively. And I decided on a grounded theory method because I did not want to start with a hypothesis. Grounded theory allowed me to just collect raw data and build a theory from the ground up. I conducted 17 semi-structured interviews over Zoom. They were 45 to 90 minutes each, so quite substantial interviews. The sample included 2 couples. They were interviewed individually though. And the questions focused on key themes related to both of the research questions. I had about 20 interview questions for each person. Let's look a bit at my sample. So in terms of gender, it was more heavily women. There were about 30% men and 1 person who identified as gender non-binary. It's worth noting that within the man and woman category, there were 4 people who specified that they had a loose attachment to their gender identity. So not maybe as heteronormative as average. And then in terms of sexual orientation, the majority identified as either pansexual or bisexual. And you'll notice those percentages add up to more than 100% because some people put both or put more than one category. So actually it was a minority of people who identified as straight, only 3 out of 17. We had 1 person who was heteroflexible, and then 1 person who identified as bi-polysexual. So they integrated polyamory in their sexual orientation, which indicates that for some people, it is a rigid orientation. It's not just a lifestyle choice. In terms of age, it was well distributed across the age spectrum between 25 years old to 85 years old. And then the race and ethnicity is where I had perhaps the least diversity with a sample that was largely white, with only 1 person who was indigenous, 1 half Asian, and 2 Ashkenazi Jewish, which reflects a lot of the polyamorous literature so far. Although through a conversation with a local counselor, I discovered that this might not be actually representative of the polyamorous or consensually non-monogamous population, but more of a function of the recruitment methods, which for me and for a lot of researchers focus on listservs that have to do with academia. So if I had to redo this research, I would perhaps change my recruitment methods to get more of that race and ethnicity variety. Little look at the marital status here. More than half of my participants were married. Some of them were single or divorced, a couple domestic partnered. About half had children. Spirituality and religion was quite varied, but you'll probably notice that there was no Christians, nobody who identified as Jewish or the main Western religions. It was more about spirituality and agnosticism. And then in terms of the education, it was a highly educated sample. More people were in the higher income brackets and more people were on the West Coast than not. So again, it's pretty common for CNM research to have this kind of sample. moving on to what is the experience of compersion. So this is really where the meat is. Research question number 1 was, how do people experience compersion? And I, through the data, came up with 3 components. Empathic joy and gratitude for benefits brought about by partners' other relationships were more of the structural components, like what compersion is. And then the third one, compersion as fluid, dynamic, and on a spectrum, was more of a dimensional component, like how does it show up? But those 3 components really showed up consistently in all of my interviews. So they were very solid, and they were expressed in different ways through those key aspects that you can see on the right side of the table. I'm going to describe some of those key aspects in the following slides through quotes of participants and also some examples. So the first component, empathic joy, was reflected through expansion of personal boundaries. And here is a participant quote to exemplify that. Bethan, who was a woman in her early 30s, said, "It's as simple as, I love this person and seeing them be happy is happy making. That is the most basic part of being in love, wanting the person to be happy." And similarly, Teresa in her mid-60s said, she called compersion big love. She says, "I feel big love when my kid opens a present. I see the look on their face and I get so excited watching them. It's not me wishing that my kid's present was mine. I'm excited for them. And their joy is my joy." In the same way, when Richard was with another woman, where he had some really beautiful experiences, even just watching him sexually be with another woman, it's not so much that I was turned on by it. Not like, oh, watching is my thing. It wasn't that. His joy, his absolute bliss, made me feel like he was opening a gift in front of me. So I love this quote. It really shows that compersion is, can go along with sexuality, but it's not just about voyeurism. It's not just that. It's really sharing somebody's bliss without feeling threatened by it. That said, there is definitely a sexual component to compersion that gets reflected in a sense of erotic excitement. It shows up as resexualization of partners through a third person gaze, a taboo quality that can be exciting, and the process of alchemizing jealousy into desire, which is really interesting. There's a few theorists and philosophers that talk about the valence of emotions and how raw emotion can sometimes be interpreted in different ways, which also got described by some of my participants. So jealousy and desire are not that far apart, and sometimes it takes a mindset to take you in one direction or the other. So for example, Diane in her mid-50s, who had opened her 30-year relationship with her husband, said, "With us being together for 30 years, boredom sets into the sex life. But as I started seeing other people, my sex life became even better with my husband. I'd come back from a date and I'd be like, hey, baby, let's get it on." And he liked that. So there's definitely this sense of erotic excitement that comes into empathic joy. And third, there was attitudinal versus embodied compersion. Attitudinal showed up as an awareness that my partners make my life better and make Martin's life better for Laura Lee. So Martin was her husband. So that kind of awareness was what she talked about as compersion. On the other hand, people also described it as embodied. So Lisa, for example, said, "What it feels like, I tend to describe it as feeling sparkly, like what a sip of champagne feels like. It feels tickly and sparkly in your chest and up into your face. And I might feel a little flushed if I'm particularly excited with them. So I find it to be really almost intoxicating." So here we're getting into almost of an altered state of consciousness, which I found to be really interesting. And actually I talk about compersion as potentially a transpersonal experience. But we can see here also that different participants really describe compersion in vastly different ways and different types of empathy. So moving on to component number 2 of what is compersion, and that's the gratitude for benefits derived from partners' other relationship. And that's where we find more of a utilitarian dimension to compersion. So what were people grateful for? Oftentimes they felt that their partner being with somebody else allowed them to have a richer emotional and sexual life, a richer social life, authentic emotional expression. So if they expected compersion from their partner, they could really feel that they could express themselves fully and freely rather than having to hide something. Emotional congruence and pride. So feeling that they could have congruence between what they were feeling inside and what they were able to express in the world, in their relationship, and find pride rather than shame in their identity. Relief from guilt. Oftentimes it was relief from feeling guilty that they were not able to fulfill all of their partner's needs. So another partner coming in and fulfilling some of those needs would come in as a relief, and that was part of compersion. And then growth. So oftentimes CNM was a big vector of growth for people, and they could see that their partner was growing in ways with other partners that they were not growing with them. Oftentimes when we meet and we connect intimately with other people, we grow in different ways, and that growth benefited everyone. So there was gratitude about that. And moving on to the third component of empathic, of what is compersion. Compersion as fluid, dynamic, and on a spectrum. So that's where we get into the dimensions of compersion and what it is. So compersion was not an on or off switch for people. It was really a spectrum between jealousy, neutral, benevolence, and compersion, which also had a spectrum there of like an attitudinal compersion versus an embodied full-on experience of compersion. So Jenny described it like this. She said, it was never like a hard switch. The feeling slowly shifted, and at each point in time, there was less jealousy and slightly more compersion. There was also a sub-theme of coexistence of jealousy and compersion. Bethan said that jealousy and compersion, they're always in the same jumbled space together. So that speaks to compersion not being a rigid concept where, again, it's not an on or off switch, it's something that occurs along with other emotion, and it's very dynamic and it's very fluid. And then another sub-theme was freedom and agency. People felt that they had some level of choice as to what they were experiencing. Alexis said that there will be the seed of envy or jealousy, and there's a gateway. And when I'm tired, sometimes I'll just go into the envy or jealousy. But with that seed, I can choose to tap into the pleasure that my partner is feeling. I can choose to tap into the love that I feel for them and for their other partner. So there was a sense of being in the driver's seat of their love life. Okay, let me check the time here. I think we're doing well. So research question number 2. Let's transition here to what contexts impact compersion. And that question really speaks to how compersion can be promoted or how is it hindered. So it can contribute to CNM individuals, some insight into what might promote compersion, what they already have and what they don't. So there was 3 different categories of factors. There was individual factors, relational factors, and social factors that came into play. Within the individual factors, there was ideological commitment to CNM values, confidence and comfort within oneself. In terms of relational factors, we had security within relationship, positive integration of partners' other relationships or metamors, and then perception of benefits received. And social factors included coming into community. So again, I'm going to go into those with some examples. Ideological factors. I love this little Spider-Man photo because he feels like a superhero, but he's also feeding his mind. So ideological commitment to CNM values and mindset also ties back to the literature that says that compersion is very connected with culture and enculturation into CNM values. So people noted as reasons why they were CNM, pragmatism. So sometimes you can't have all of your needs fulfilled by one person, and same thing with your partner. So it's more pragmatic to be CNM. Ethics and politics. Some people saw it as more of an ethical decision, not wanting to be possessive and restrict the personal and sexual autonomy of their partner. Willingness to question and defy social conventions. Oftentimes you had people who already were defying social conventions in other areas, so it was kind of a logical place to be, to question mononormativity. And then of course, sex positivity, finding, having a basic attitude of sex as good and healthy. And then an ideological stance towards jealousy. So looking at jealousy as not something that must be bowed to, but something that must be looked at, embraced, but also worked with, not considering jealousy as the master, but really putting a boundary around it and choosing who you want to be. And on that note, this was one of my favorite quotes from Simon, who was 85 years old or 83 years old at the time of the interview and had been married for 35 years non-monogamously. And he said, I had a new awareness of how jealous I had become. That was like the first time he really had a jealousy crisis, and how that really fucked up my life. I felt like a terrible, terrible person. I was really embarrassed. I was driven by the sense of abandonment, of not being loved. And I realized that could not happen again. So Simon had made a very strong decision that he did not want to be driven by his jealousy and his relationship choices. And that had allowed him to go down the path of consensual non-monogamy and ultimately develop more compersion. So really the impact of a mental decision cannot be understated. Second individual factor that promoted or hindered compersion was security and comfort within oneself. So a sense of personal autonomy, self-confidence and self-esteem, and having one's own needs met really created the sense of security within oneself and having a full plate from which to feel generous and able to share. Natasha, for example, said that even in the situation where her boyfriend would fall in love with her metamor and break up with her, if they were ultimately happy doing that, I would be happy for him. I think I would ultimately find love again. So of course she didn't want that to happen, but she felt that she had enough solidity inside of herself to allow for that possibility to be a possibility, and that would not destroy her. So it speaks to a sense of secure attachment within self as well. So what were some of the main obstacles to compersion at the individual level? There was internalized mononormativity, poly under duress, which is when a partner gets dragged into polyamory against their will by a partner who really wants to be. So that makes it very difficult to feel compersion. Sexual shame and sex negativity, personal insecurity and low self-esteem, and unmet personal needs. For example, I had one participant said that if she did not get a good night of sleep, she would tend to jealousy rather than compersion. So having, again, a full plate from which to be generous and share was really key. Moving on to relational factors. So the first one was security, connectedness, and trust within the relationship. So feeling like one's relationship is healthy and solid and doesn't have a lot of trouble to begin with definitely promoted compersion. People also had strong reassurance strategies, so that correlated with some of the love languages that Gary Chapman laid out. So for some people, they wanted a lot of words to reassure their partner or to be reassured by their partner. Some people needed quality time, so they had to figure out what reassurance strategies really worked. Going at the pace of the slower person, that is obviously very hard for the faster person to do, the person who wants to really go ahead and be completely open, and then the person who's more hesitant but there's definitely a lot of opportunity for compersion when you go at the pace of the slower person. Building tolerance, so having enough patience to create comfort zones where no comfort zones previously existed. And then having strong relationship agreements, so knowing what is okay to do with your partner and with other partners and what is not, and to stick with those agreements. So that can really help couples and people in consensually non-monogamous relationships of all kinds build trust. And those relationship agreements could change over time, but it was important to have those agreements to feel safe. The second factor was the positive integration of partners' other relationships. So to have, not necessarily a close relationship with metamors, but to have positive regard and to have them integrated in a positive and healthy way through communication, having positive connections with metamor. I mean, oftentimes there was friendship there. Having good boundaries with metamors. Group sex was sometimes a factor of getting closer with metamors. And then having a fluid sexual orientation was often mentioned. And you'll remember in my sample, the majority of the people experiencing compersion in my study were not straight. So it helped to have a fluid sexual orientation so you can kind of share the turn on for your partner being with someone of the opposite gender, if that's going to be a heterosexual situation. So Michael, for example, said, I don't know how straight people do it. Because he was bisexual and he was able to really be turned on by his wife having sex with another man. So he said that his being bisexual really helped with tuning into that pleasure. And then finally, third relational factor was perception of outside relationships as additive to individual and relational satisfaction. For example, Michael again said, I have a bad knee, so I can't hike anymore. But Giselle, his wife, and Cedric, his metamor, can go hiking to Mount Olympus. And that's a joy to know that I'm not holding Giselle back from doing one of the things that she really loves. The fact that they could do that makes me really happy. So, he felt that Cedric was additive to their relationship satisfaction instead of taking something away. And Alice said, it gets me a lot more friends because I get to be friends with my partner's partners, and that's really fun. So she said that as an extrovert, non-monogamy worked really well for her. Let's move on to relational obstacles to compersion. Some of the main ones were betrayal or lack of consent. So if a relationship agreement was broken, it was obviously very difficult to feel compersion for a partner. Lack of consent, same thing. If someone involved was not consenting to the relationships that they were in, so for example, if somebody's partner was dating someone who was cheating on their partner, there would be a breach of trust and a breach of the ability to feel compersion for that relationship because someone was not fully consenting. Relationship difficulties, if people had existing difficulties in the relationship and didn't feel like they came from a full plate relationally, it was more difficult to experience compersion. Feeling excluded, so feeling like you're being hidden something and your partner is not being transparent was a big obstacle. Not liking or trusting a metamor. And then Colette exemplified that as saying, generally I can have a pretty good dose of compersion, but a strong exception to that is when my husband dated a woman who I felt did not respect my place in the relationship. And she actively did not want to meet me. So that speaks to, the lack of positive integration of the metamors. Okay, and the final factor was social, and that was coming into community. That really played a big role in promoting compersion. Having pride in one's CNM identity rather than shame, having some polymedia and literature to really help articulate what consensual non-monogamy is and kind of wrap your head around it because there aren't a lot of social models, so books and literature like The Ethical Slut, More Than Two, Opening Up. Some of those books were really a big part of people's identity development as polyamorous or CNM. Having role models was really helpful, people to talk to, people to look up to as a healthy model of CNM. And then having CNM social networks like CNM poly potlucks, or people to talk to and to validate one's identity was really promoting compersion. And then finally, the obstacles to compersion at the social level were mononormativity and stigma, just at the social level, and then a lack of inclusive community for racial and ethnic minorities. My one Indigenous participant noted that she never felt comfortable going to polyamorous potlucks and events because she didn't feel like she was seeing herself reflected. She was the only person of color there a lot of the time, so there was a sense that she did not belong, and she had a hard time finding a sense of community in polyamory. So what does that all teach us? The combination of the first research question and the second research question culminated in this proposed theory of compersion, where both of those questions really meet and show us how compersion arises. On the left side of this schema, you have ideological commitment to CNM values and mindset, and then coming into community. So you have the meaning-making piece of what promotes compersion. And then on the right side, you have what creates security or a lack of threat. So there's the comfort and security at the individual level, and then security, connectedness, and trust in the relationship. So the combination of the meaning-making and the lack of threat led people to feel that they could positively integrate their partner's other relationships and also perceive those relationships as additive to personal and relationship satisfaction. And then those two things led to empathic joy and gratitude for the benefits brought about by partners' other relationship, which were the primary constituents of compersion. And then at the dimensional level, compersion was also fluid, dynamic, and on a spectrum. So all of the themes that we just went through individually all really coalesce into this theory, which shows what compersion is, but also how does this happen? That was one of the main contributions of my study. I also came up with two proposed definitions of compersion that I actually have been bugging the Merriam-Webster about. I want them to include compersion in the dictionary to really help make this word more visible, make this reality more visible. So the first definition that I propose is that compersion refers to the positive thoughts, emotions, and/or sensations obtained from knowing of one intimate partner's gratifying experience of an intimate connection with another person. The term was coined and typically used in the context of CNM intimate relationships. So that's the more classical definition in the context of CNM. And it shows that it doesn't only refer to feeling, but also refers to thoughts and emotions and/or sensations in the body. And then the second definition that I propose is a more general context definition, where it's not just about intimate relationships, but it's about positive thoughts, emotions, and/or sensation derived from knowing of another person's gratifying experience. It may refer to empathic joy, resonance, and/or attitudinal support. So that could happen, let's say your brother is getting a promotion or your best friend is finding love and you're just really sharing into their joy, even though you're not in the center of it. And then compersive would refer to the quality of a person who experiences compersion. So if anyone wants to take a screenshot and send it to the Merriam-Webster and continue bugging them to include this, this word in the dictionary, that would be great. So my discussion section had a lot of different points. I'm not going to go into all of them right now because I don't have time. I would love to. But some of the main points that I make are how important the role of coming out and pride are in compersion. Compersion had so much to do with really embracing one's identity as consensually non-monogamous. And the process of coming out is very similar to coming out as LGBTQ. It's first getting confronted with the reality of mononormativity and the fact that we live in a society that does not support non-monogamous relationships, and being okay with affirming a different identity that is countercultural, and then coming out to oneself first and coming out to others. And that was a big aspect of compersion, was that kind of identity development. Then I also looked at compersion through the lenses of altruism, reciprocal altruism, and empathy. So that goes to the question of, is compersion utilitarian, or is it really just an empathic joy phenomenon that's based on altruism and wanting somebody else to be happy? Well, just as a scoop, it's not an either or. Those things really work together. And then I look at compersion as a transpersonal state. That empathic joy factor is not something that usually gets spoken a lot in scientific papers, but the transpersonal lens really helps understand what happens here when the self is expanded. So you'll have to read my dissertation for more details on those. Practical implications for scholarship and praxis. So really, I think that the biggest contribution of this research is that understanding compersion helps dismantle mononormativity, because it puts into question the assumption of inevitability and inflexibility of jealousy. And then that trickles into many fields. Psychology, neuroscience, and social sciences all assume jealousy as the only response to extradyadic intimacy. Sexuality and CNM studies were very burgeoning fields where those fields really want to know more about how compersion happens, how CNM is conducted, and what promotes relationship satisfactions in those relationships. Philosophy and ethics. There's a debate in philosophy as to whether monogamy and or non-monogamy are morally permissible. And again, oftentimes the assumption of jealousy being the only response is at the core of this debate. But if we throw compersion at the matter, it can really change the outcome of that debate. And then law. We live in a mononormative society where monogamous couples get a lot of privileges, like housing privileges, work privileges, and there's no legal protection for consensual non-monogamous people. There's people working on that right now. There's a new committee in the APA working on non-monogamy and wanting that group to benefit from new legal protections under anti-discrimination laws. But this is hard because of the stronghold of mononormativity. So there's definitely an impact to be had at the social legal level. And then finally, practical implications for intimate relationships. This study provides a roadmap to create optimal conditions for compersion, which we know also correlates with relationship satisfaction, so it can help improve the quality of CNM relationships. And it can reduce some of the harmful pressure and shame that CNM people have had to face. So for example, knowing that jealousy and compersion can coexist reduces some of the shame that people can feel when they feel jealousy. So it's not that you should feel compersion instead of jealousy, is that both of those things are normal and acceptable, and you can expect to feel both. And then compersion is not an on or off switch. Again, it's normal to not feel it all the time. And it's normal to feel it in different ways. Like some people felt it in attitudinal and in an embodied way. So it really promotes a sense of agency, especially knowing that if you don't feel it in an embodied way, you can still have an attitude that is compersive, and that also qualifies. And it's just very healthy to have that. You don't have to have the embodied experience in order to have a very good CNM relationship. And future research directions, I would love to see this model tested with a larger and more diverse sample. Adding personality measures like the big 5 personality measures would be great to understand when and where compersion happens. Looking at attachment theory, that would be fantastic, because I'm sure there's a lot of relationships between compersion and attachment styles. The neurobiology of compersion, especially through the lens of cognitive versus embodied compersion. These at the neurological level, when we study empathy, they occupy 2 different circuits. So it would be great to see if those different flavors of compersion map onto the same neurological circuits. And then the role of relationship structure in compersion. So whether someone is in a primary/secondary relationship, and what roles they occupy in those, versus relationship anarchy or solo polyamorous people. What does those roles, how do they impact compersion, would be really fascinating to look at. So thank you so much again for listening, and we're going to move into some questions on my research.
Excellent presentation, Marie. Thank you so much.
Okay.
So now the committee will have a chance to ask you some questions, and thought we would, like I mentioned earlier, start with Cassie. So do you have some questions for our candidate?
I do. I have 3 questions that come to mind. And I'd like to remind everyone that I am a sociologist, so we study what happens between people. So my approach sort of frames the questions that I'm asking you, Marie. So the first question, you had mentioned earlier in your presentation, and also in proposing a definition of compersion, that you can have compersion in non-romantic contexts, right? So I'm wondering if you could speak to a couple of examples that might illuminate what how compersion can be, I guess, experienced in outside of intimate relationships.
Yeah, thank you for that question. So there's so many instances where we share the happiness of people we love. Like I mentioned, like your friend or your brother getting a good promotion at work, or your friend falling in love with someone. And in those cases, there still is room for jealousy. Oftentimes we do experience jealousy when people get something that we want, but there's a sense of wanting to share wholeheartedly into people's happiness. And actually in Buddhism, there's a word in Sanskrit called mudita that refers to that quality of sharing into the happiness of people we love by removing the separation between ourselves and others. And that really speaks to that fundamental ability that we have as humans to empathically share somebody's joy. So it can really happen in any situation where we perceive somebody having a good day.
Okay, thank you. Okay, the second question deals with some of the variables that you use in your sample. So you talk about your 17 research participants, and you have these great charts that show us gender identity and sexual orientation, and race and ethnicity and religion. And so I'm wondering if maybe you could speak. I'm mostly curious about gender and sexual orientation, but maybe you could speak to each of these characteristics in terms of some of the differences or maybe some similarities in how your participants experience some of these aspects of compersion. I'm thinking specifically of maybe how different sexual orientations might experience something like erotic excitement or even jealousy. Did you notice any differences that are based on specifically sexual orientation and gender, but maybe some of the other variables you discussed?
So I did not notice anything in terms of gender, but definitely in terms of sexual orientation, there was a sense that people who were not straight had an easier time really participating in the sexual excitement that their partner had with someone of the opposite gender. So they felt like they could dive in with them because there was not the sense of, oh, like I'm not attracted to this gender, so I can't really relate. There was a sense that when there was a fluidity of sexual orientation, they could really feel more included as well. And sometimes that inclusion, you know, like a part of that was having group sex with their partner and metamors, but not always. It was not always the case. So yeah, having a fluid sense of gender as well, I think could have been a factor, even though I'm not sure. I would speculate that the less, like the more loosely someone is attached to their gender identity and to a heteronormative worldview, the easier it would be to empathize with somebody else and their relationships, because there isn't as much of a sense of separation with, you know, between self and others, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. Just a sneak in probing follow-up question then. You had talked also about agreements and arrangements in CNM relationships. Did any of those agreements or relationships that your interviewees talked about embrace gender monogamy or restrict based on gender? Did you notice any differences in terms of maybe creating some, I don't know, rules or even having veto power based on gender and maybe even sexual orientation?
That's a great question. There were a couple of women who said that their first inclination to become consensually non-monogamous was because they were bisexual and they were with a primary male partner, and they wanted to be able to also have a female sexual partner, and that was easier to accept for their male partner, for them to be with a female partner rather than to be with another male partner. So it sometimes started as, you know, like it's okay if you're going to be with another woman, but I don't want you to be with another man. But oftentimes those relationship agreements would also evolve. Like once there was a sense of comfort around one agreement, like, okay, it's fine if you want to be with women, then it could perhaps take off the edge to the next step with, you know, which could be to be with other men.
Okay. Because I guess my mind goes then to thinking that you could experience compersion with in certain contexts and then have more of a difficult situation in others, right? So if I'm bisexual and I have a male lover and a female lover, cisgendered, whatever, and so I would feel more compersive toward the male partner maybe than the female partner, that there might be some nuance there, right, depending on sexual orientation.
Right. Because again, like the map of compersion that I showed at the end, like the proposed theory shows on one side of the graph, you know, like the meaning making, and on the other side, the lack of threat. So different situations will invoke different levels of threat. And oftentimes, you know, like those have to do with gender, and also certain people will make us feel more insecure. Like, for example, there was one woman, Colette, and these are all pseudonyms, by the way. I should have mentioned at the beginning, I'm using people's pseudonyms instead of their real names. But she said that with certain women that her husband was dating, she felt completely fine. But if the woman had certain attributes, like, oh, she was like thinner or younger or something like that, it might be a little bit harder to feel compersion because there was more of an inherent sense of competition or comparison and insecurity. So really each situation lent itself to different levels of threat or perceived threat.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, great, thank you. And I guess my final question, you know, in thinking throughout your presentation and the research that you've done, as a sociologist, I'm always thinking of how we can socialize people, right? And how we can expand our socialization with intimate relationships. How can we maybe teach people about, you know, some of these aspects of everything from jealousy to compersion? So what are your thoughts on going forth, can we teach compersion? Is this something that we can start to socialize our future generations about so that they can anticipate it or experience it or maybe welcome it? I just wondered what your thoughts are on the socialization of compersion.
That's a great question. I think that just having a word for it goes a long way in terms of socialization, because so much of our socialization is brought about by language. And that's part of why I really felt like it was important to research compersion, to kind of bring the word on the map a little bit more, because as long as it's not going to be in the dictionary, as long as it's not going to be in the common parlance, it's going to be a lot harder to, teach it or share about the possibility of it. It's like when we don't know that something is possible, it's a lot harder to experience it. So yeah, the word being more visible is really the first step. And then really cultivating compersion in non-intimate life situations, like coming back to your first question, to, look at where we are jealous in our everyday life, and, can we cultivate being more empathic towards other people's joy? And from that, cultivating a worldview that is not a zero-sum worldview, but more of a, I get to share into your joy, why wouldn't I?
Right. Excellent. Those are my 3 questions, Marie.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Nicole, do you have some questions?
I have also 3 questions, and I'm going to pick up right where Dr. Wasik left off. You just said something along the lines of language drives the capacity to learn about this experience. So you kind of talked quite a bit about Merriam-Webster and having a term being really important. And while I appreciate the sociolinguistics of this, I wanted to think a little bit as a psychologist with you about this. And I'm going to speak a little bit to your parents here who are online right here. I was really touched by this story that you opened with, stating that your parents made a very kind of, they organized something. It's very, very empathic, very structured, and they decided to have you. And I'm guessing there's a lot that went into that arrangement, which you experienced from day one as a child. And I'm just wondering if perhaps you think that there's some way of knowing that compersion is possible, being different from having a word or some sort of structure from your research, that knowing is actually a lived experience. And I'm wondering if you could say something about people being more compersive or less compersive based on seeing other people around them who are compersive in a long-term way. And I'm making up a story in my mind and kind of talking about your family. I'm assuming it was very compersive, but you don't have to get into your personal history, but certainly talk to me a little bit about experience.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think having role models, like modeling a behavior, whether it's in childhood or in adulthood, is one of the main ways that we learn besides language. I actually, as a parenthesis, I did have a participant say that he learned that compersion was possible, and it, the door was open for him when he saw one of his lovers being compersive towards him, and it blew his mind. It blew his mind that a woman could really enjoy the fact that he was sharing in sexual intimacy with somebody else. So to have demonstrated that behavior showed him the possibility. And I think that it's the same thing for me in my experience, because I've seen that behavior demonstrated to me, honestly, not so much in the intimate realm, but just in general, in having a lot of people around me model not a jealous kind of possessive worldview of relationships, but more of an acceptance and approaching love more in terms of, I want you to be happy and fulfill your potential, rather than I want you to do what I want in order for me to love you. So it really comes down to, how do we even conceptualize love, and how do we approach love in relationships?
Great,
So
thank you.
That's a question.
My second question has to do with how psychology has treated envy and jealousy throughout history. So starting with Melanie Klein, her theories of envy, one could take the view of your entire research and say, okay, compersion is a bypass of envy and conflict. Or we could talk about it as a spiritual bypass if we'd like to. Could you say a little bit? I'm not saying I agree, but I'd like you to talk and push back on those ideas for a little bit.
Yeah, so for the majority of my participants, they all expressed having a very intimate relationship with jealousy. So there was, you know, maybe a couple of people who said they had never really experienced a lot of jealousy, but that was the exception rather than the rule. Most people who did experience compersion as a big part of their lives and their relationships had to have a very deep process dealing with their jealousy. So it was not a bypass. It was the product of going into their jealousy and looking at it with fresh eyes and ask, like, what is this jealousy there for? What is it teaching me? What is it pointing to? Is this a childhood wound somewhere where I haven't felt enough love in my life? And how can I give myself this love? Or how can I ask for this kind of reassurance from my partners? How can I build the sense of security inside of myself so that my jealousy doesn't just erupt at every moment through triggers where I don't want it to erupt? I don't feel like I want to be a slave of my jealousy in those situations. So that process of investigating the jealousy and validating it, but also bringing love in those places that are hurt, was what allowed people to experience compersion.
Wonderful, wonderful. So the last question I have is about BIPOC folks. They were not included notably, and you mentioned at several points that you'd like to continue your research. What do you think they would have said if they were included? What do you think might be different? And why do you think their voices are missing?
Yeah, great question. I think that their voices are missing because of the recruitment strategy that I used. Instead of, you know, really going on the ground, you know, and really looking for them, I resorted to what most academics do, which is email listservs. And usually on email listserv, you have a high concentration of academics and people in higher socioeconomic stratas. And after I already had conducted my research, I had conversations with a local counselor, Kathy Labriola, who said, you know, my clientele, my CNM clientele does not really reflect your sample. They're actually a majority of BIPOC people in the people that I'm helping. So that made me realize, oh, like the research is not necessarily representative of who's out there actually being consensually non-monogamous. I think that's why those voices are missing. And I wish, you know, I want to do more research in the future to include more of those voices. And what do I speculate I would hear from them about compersion if I had those voices? I think I might hear more about the obstacles to compersion because there's more, you know, likely to have to be obstacles, you know, like in the same way that people face obstacles when they are part of a racial or ethnic minority. There's more pressure to conform in other ways to the mainstream or the dominant paradigm. So it's about intersectionality. It's about like having to embrace two minority identities rather than just one or more. It adds to the difficulty of it. It adds to the difficulty of coming out as a CNM person, because, you know, if you're seen as a CNM person, but you're white, you still have some privilege. But if you're CNM and you're Black, you might be more likely to be labeled as a player, or as, you know, having low morals, or, you know, like there might be more prejudice. So it makes it harder to really come out at CNM. So that would be my speculation.
Thank you, Marie.
Well, Marie, I have two questions for you, but I just wanted to say first how much I appreciate your work and your presentation and the clarity of it, the organization of it, the nuance you brought to it, your unwillingness to be reductive or pathologizing about any of it. It was all lovely and tremendously important. And I think what makes me happiest when I see research like this is that it gives voice to something that has been so heavily repressed, both personally and culturally. And I really appreciate that about your work. So thank you for that. So I have two questions. The first one is, so you've done a grounded study methodology. And so briefly, could you give us some sense of how you went from the interviews and the data that that produced to those three components or themes that you ended up with?
Yeah, sure. So I had 17 interviews, which I transcribed and printed out. I have a big binder. And I started with open coding, which means that I extracted units of meaning from each one of those interviews. Like every time someone talked about, let's say, sexual orientation, or about a specific factor that promotes compersion, or compersion as empathy, compersion as gratitude, I would put those units of meaning in different buckets, so to speak. And then once I had, I had like 150 buckets of different units of meaning, I started condensing those into bigger groupings of meaning. And that, that was divided into the two research questions, like what is compersion, and then what factors impact compersion. And so in each one of those groupings, I had different themes that emerged from those data, from those units of meanings. So it was kind of first very, very diverse units of meaning, and then like condensing them into bigger themes. And these were the themes that emerged, like that's where the saturation of the data actually happened, is when I could not condense them anymore, where the themes really stood on their own solidly, and there was no more condensation to be made, and where there was no additional data that would bring in new themes. Like all the new interviews that came in were just confirming the themes that had already emerged.
Very good. And my last question is, what surprised you during the process?
It's a good question. What surprised me? I think just the variety of ways that people describe compersion. I came in with, an idea of what it was, and then I had 17 people and so many different definitions of compersion. Especially the fact that for some people it was more of a cognitive experience, and for some people it was an embodied experience. That felt really revelatory to me. It felt very just fascinating that people had different experiences but gave it the same name. And that speaks to the kind of agency that CNM people generally display in choosing their language and choosing their own meaning that they apply to life and relationships. So yeah, the variety.
That makes perfect sense. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So now I want to check with the committee to make sure that you both have my phone number. And so we are going to confer. So I want to invite the committee to mute yourself and turn off your video, and then give me a call so we can have a conference call. And while we're doing that, I want to invite all of you who are present here to go ahead and unmute yourself and have some conversation and ask your own questions while we're away. And then we'll be back shortly.
Bye. Hey, what's up, everybody?
Hi. Hey, Marie.
Hi.
You're a hard act to follow, gal.
Oh,
You just kept going on in detail and detail, and I go, oh boy, oh boy.
It's so hard to run out of time, like I practiced a couple times, and I just really, it's hard to keep it under 45 minutes. So sorry, it was a very fast.
Oh, that's even more, that's even better. I just love it. I did have a question, especially in the coding. You said open coding, and I've done it, obviously, as we all probably have. But what's the difference between open coding and some other type? I thought it was all open.
Well, there's focused coding, which, like you code according to predetermined categories.
Right.
So that's the only other one that I know of. But for grounded theory, which, is like you collect raw data from the interviews and you don't have a predetermined theory or hypothesis, that was the way to code
Oh, that's cool. That's cool. The other thing I wanted to comment on is what Craig was saying, that you did it without pathologizing. And I didn't even think of pathology as you was talking about it. I was just trying to just see it better, just really get in there, because I think me, like everybody else, has had the jealousy and all. We know that part of the story. But to see this is just, it actually, I made a note here. It actually made me think that this research chips away at some core issues of our society, which are very negative: possessivism, jealousy, blah. I just went on and on. And this kind of like really tears a big piece of that wallpaper off. And I said, yes, yes.
You know it, yeah.
Yeah. So thank you so much. Very encouraging.
Thank you. Yeah, it's fascinating to watch how people who either are monogamous or non-monogamous tend to sometimes pathologize each other. Like there's this, kind of war between the two groups, where people who are hardcore monogamists will say that people who are not monogamous are, unhealthy or less than or immoral, or they will pathologize them in some sense. And then the opposite often happens, where people who are non-monogamous will say that people who are monogamous are just not evolved enough to be open, like they're too much of a slave of their jealousy. And that's really a false dichotomy. Like what I want, the wallpaper that I want to rip is not monogamy, it's mononormativity. It's the idea that monogamy should be the only way, should be the normal way or the better way. That's what causes pain. It's not, monogamy, because any consensual arrangement between adults has the potential to be amazing and lead to beautiful love. And people need different kinds of relationships at different points of their life, in my opinion. So to pathologize one another is a trap.
Oh.
Yeah, thank you, Ruben. Hey, Brian.
Hey, congratulations on this amazing presentation and the culmination of your research. It's really fascinating and inspiring to see this process. I guess I wanted to ask, I'm really curious about the theory you put forth. Seems like it could be, kind of just reflecting on your own experience and your, having the opportunity to do this research and surround yourself in the culture. You mentioned like how important words can be and books for people, like how, more than to like, give people a framework to, participate in these relational styles. And so I'm really curious about how, if you could maybe speak to how you envision sort of carrying this work of yours forward. I've read some of your articles that have been written for mainstream audiences, and it's like really exciting to see that out there, and really, really profound, important work, I think. And so I'm really curious if you have any plans or any creative visions for carrying this work, and particularly your theory, forward.
Yeah, thank you. Definitely. I want to, translate my dissertation into a book format for a more popular audience, for people to be able to benefit from it. And I think that the main contribution for people who are non-monogamous will be to identify like where, like if they want to create or lay down the terrain for more compersion in their life, then they can identify where the bottlenecks are. Like, is it at the relational level? Is it at the individual level, or at the social level? Like, where are the places where they can act to create the most impact? So I think that will be really great to have in a book format. I definitely want to publish it and make it available. And who knows, maybe one day I can create an online course based on that. I haven't decided the next steps, but I definitely don't want the dissertation to just sit on a shelf and never be looked at again.
Hi, Marie. I'm a first-year HSX student, and I'm really grateful for your work. I'm interested in similar topics. I wanted to ask a question. For my dissertation, I'm interested in looking at the sexual orientation, potential sexual orientation of attraction to couples as opposed to attraction to individuals. And I was wondering if you ran into anyone or descriptions of that in your work or even in your literature reviews about, I'm guessing if it does exist, that is a sexual orientation, that those people may have a higher propensity for compersion and are more likely to be in consensually non-monogamous relationships. And I was just curious if you ran into that description at all, the idea that it was an orientation to choose non-monogamous structures, or the idea of compersion was part of an orientation.
Interesting. You know, thank you for your question and nice to meet you, Sally.
You too.
I have not read anything about sexual orientation, you know, towards couples rather than individuals. That is actually very new to me and I'm super curious about it. There were a lot of my participants, however, who described their desire to be consensually non-monogamous as a sexual orientation, as something that they were born with, as a rigid orientation rather than a lifestyle choice. And they said that this actually helped them feel compersion because there was already an alignment intrinsically between who they felt like they were and how they were acting in the world. Like there wasn't as much of a culture clash coming from that sense of rigid orientation. And I can, you know, just speculate that I think people who are attracted to couples more than individuals per se, probably that would lend itself very well to compersion. Like I don't see why it wouldn't. It would make sense, but I don't know for sure. But I hope you look at that in your research. I'm excited to hear more. Thank you.
Hey, Marie, c'est Paul. Hi.
Oh, hey, Paul. Hi.
Hello, how are you?
Good, good.
Good. Hey, I have a question for you. And, actually two. One is you mentioned translating, in other words, putting this into some other format. Have you ever considered translating this into French, perhaps, for the Francophone world? One. And two, I'm going to put my historian's hat on here for a moment, since that's my academic background along with language. This is largely a synchronic study, so it's kind of a snapshot. It's a snapshot in time of different people. Have you considered what we often call in history a diachronic study, kind of a longitudinal study, if you will? Over time, I know Eli Sheff has been doing that with polyamorous families, but specifically on the topic of compersion, perhaps a longitudinal study might be in the offing for you. I don't know. I'm sure there isn't much research on it from what you shared, right? So, yeah, and yeah, now I'll leave the comments up to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Wow, that is so interesting. I actually was thinking at the beginning of designing my research project that having more of a longitudinal aspect to it, like at least over 6 months or a year, and comparing experiences of compersion just even within that time period would have been interesting. I didn't do it just for time's sake, you know, and just kind of, you know, it's hard to do that big of a research project, but I think it would be fascinating to look at people over the course of an entire relationship, like many years, and how does compersion change within the same relationships, depending on also like different partners that move in and out of people's lives. I mean, there's just so much to be done, and yeah, there haven't been any longitudinal studies so far on compersion, so that would be great. I'll have to think about whether I'm going to be the researcher for that one, but yeah, that's a really good point. And translating that into French, I'll have to hire some help for that. So, yeah.
Thank you, Marie. Félicitations. Congratulations. You're welcome.
Okay. All right. Oh, John.
Okay, can you hear me? I suspect. And I'm here in Seattle with my friends Bob and Carol and Ted and Alice, who have been struggling with compersion since 1969. And a couple of observations. It just occurred to me when you were speaking that perhaps the correct other pole of compersion is Schadenfreude rather than jealousy.
Mm-hmm.
One might make a case for that. And then I often, my academic background is in molecular genetics. And so when people say that they were, you know, that they were born polyamorous or whatever, I have to think about that. And my feeling is that people are in general drawn to other people that they see for various reasons. They're drawn to multiple partners and they refuse to act on it if they buy into a strict monogamy. But I don't think the sort of construct of polyamory, which is a pretty cerebral construct, is particularly inborn. It's just the propensity to want something like that, and maybe to also want to be ethical. The people who aren't ethical have no problem having other partners without making something as complicated as polyamory. And then I want to say that what I think you've done is absolutely brilliant. And I'm trying to avoid saying that from a point of view of confirmation bias, because you've said a lot of what I believe, except much better than I've been able to. So thank you for that.
Thank you. Yeah, these are all great points. Yeah, that Schadenfreude would be more of a direct opposite to compersion. It's another word, and interestingly enough, that we don't have, you know, a word in English for.
That's true.
So yeah, we need to we need to increase our language to just reflect the diversity of emotions that we're feeling. And yeah, you know, whether non-monogamy or monogamy is inborn is definitely a debate, but there's no evidence for that so far. There's no, you know, evidence that there is a distinction, you know, as people are born. I think that it's more about nurture and how people grow up, even if sometimes that can feel like an inherent sexual orientation, but you know, like those experiences that we have as children or as infants, I think probably have more to do with it than biology per se. Yay, Glenn. Hi.
Congratulations, Marie. It's great to see you come to this point of your journey.
Thank you. Thanks for coming.
And nice work. Really, really well presented. I have two questions. One is where are you going to publish this?
You tell
if you're,
I'm gonna ask you.
in article form. And the other is, I was really interested in that, you know, your observation that people for whom this worked tended to be more fluid in their sexual orientation. And I think it's a great idea to follow up like with a, you know, Big Five kind of personality questionnaire, because, you know, openness to experience, something like that would correlate. But and you know, I appreciated your graphic there with the kind of the theoretical construct, and I just kind of wondered how and whether you think that the notion of kind of a almost like a sexual orientation would impact, I mean, obviously it doesn't impact kind of the meaning of the word, but whether that would have any impact on your construction of a theory. In other words, I can certainly see how having that kind of an orientation would reduce the sense of threat. But if you thought it was more foundationally a sexual orientation, whether that kind of lies as a deeper structure, as a more causative structure than simply the absence of threat.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. I can imagine that people who have a flexible sexual orientation, generally speaking, have already done some work of defying social norms. So that really goes hand in hand with, you know, when you defy and question one social norm, you tend to defy and question more than one. So there's really kind of like a symbiotic relationship there, I think, to be had when you question the rigidity of gender norms and sexual orientation norms, then non-monogamy kind of comes more naturally. So I would see that sense of sexual orientation more on the meaning-making side of things, where, and again, I think it would probably correlate with some of those personality measures, like being okay with ambiguity and being okay with risk and new experiences and being countercultural in a way to see ourselves as more fluid in our relationship choices rather than having to make really prescribed choices. So it all really kind of feeds off one another.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Great, so the committee is back, and I'm happy to say that in our unanimous opinion, you have passed your dissertation defense.
Yay!
So congratulations, Dr. Thouin-Savard. And the great thing about being a chair is I get to be the first person to call you doctor.
Hey.
Excellent work.
Congratulations.
We also, we don't recommend any changes to the dissertation, but the committee did have a few things to suggest by way of moving forward with your work. So I'll just open that space a little bit. And then after that, I actually have to run in a few minutes, but I'm going to leave this open so people can talk and you can just continue Q&A or just have some discussion. So, but the committee does have a couple of suggestions.
Great.
So, Doctor, I'd like to say a few things by way of helping you to move your career and your work forward. First of all, congratulations. It's been a delight working with you, particularly in the places where we were really intimately involved with the data. So those reams that you talked about, I really enjoyed all of the conversations that we had where we were really walking through the nuances of those data. And I kind of still have some of their stories in my mind. And so I'm thinking there's so many different ways to move your work forward. Some of the ones that I think could be really illustrative would be in popular audience media and maybe even a popular audience book that helps people take your model and think about how they can move toward compersion. That may require additional interviews or some sort of additional framework to make it for popular audiences, but that seems like a really ripe endeavor for CNM communities and for people who are on the outside who are considering possibly wanting to think about jealousy and think about compersion. The other thing that I would love to see you do, if you feel interested in writing papers or thinking about academic audiences, is to delve into these interviews a little bit more with a different lens. So not a grounded theory lens, but perhaps a case study lens or a phenomenological lens, so that you can actually get even more detail from singular cases, particularly cases that are edge cases or cases that have some sort of unique features, someone who is bi and trans and also, this and that, and you could, extract more detail from their actual personal story to help you think about the particularities of compersion. There may be cases where people are in their first compersive experience, or people who have been compersive in lots of relationships. That's one dimension that I'd like to see compared between the different stories. Or there may be other ideas for future research that come out of just singular cases. I'd also love, I'm a big fan of kind of the minutia of sampling. And I think because of convenience and because of how hard it is to get folks to respond to studies like this in some sort of reasonable time frame, you don't want to be paying tuition forever. So I totally understand and supported your sampling. But I think it would be good to consider going into different communities of color, different folks who might not use CNM language or might not use terms like compersion, but are absolutely living in the same way that you describe, would be super helpful to really expand what you understand as your data set. So it feels like there's a little bit of inclusion work to be done from my perspective, and that could be extremely rich in thinking about those things. I'm also super interested in the overlap between autism, sensory processing, and polyphenomena. There's a lot that we're learning in psychology about people's need for stimulation in various ways. So some people like to be, getting deep pressure stimulation, or people who don't like to be touched, and, all of these kinds of things. Seems like it's on the autism spectrum, seems like it might be useful. I'm not trying to pathologize the poly community, but there is an overlap there that could be interesting. And just thinking about diversities, neurodiversities, and sexual diversities in the form of sensory the sensory world. So those are my ideas. I know you to be an amazing dating coach. There's a huge need during COVID for people to have skills and capacity to get outside of their houses. This work could help that. I'm able to write you recommendation letters and to support your career. It's been an honor to be part of this, and congratulations.
Wow, thank you so much, Nicole. Wow, these are powerful suggestions, and it's been an honor to work with you too. I feel so lucky.
All right, so I just would like to echo everything that Nicole said. I mean, my comments are very similar to hers. I don't think any microphone will diffuse the background noise. So my apologies for this. I'll keep it very brief then. To just say, I would love to see you publish a couple of journal articles from this research. I'd like to see a book that straddles the academic with the civilian, I guess, with the popular culture. That's my joy to see. Maybe there's empathic joy in seeing others experience research. So I'm sorry this is so noisy, you guys. They're literally working right outside my door. So I'll just leave it at this. Congratulations. We will talk individually. I'd also like to see an educational workshop for youth, maybe ages 8 to 12, that confront issues regarding jealousy and compersion. I mean, we have mental health programs that deal with all sorts of self-esteem issues and agency and autonomy. And I just feel like it might be really great for early childhood socialization to start kids when they're young being aware of some of these feelings. And that might be one way to, you know, engage those socialization processes. So maybe you could add that on the list as well. And congratulations, Dr. Marie.
Oh, thank you. You know, it's amazing that you're bringing that up, because I just received an email a few weeks ago from a woman who has for a project to build a coloring book for teens about compersion. And she was asking if I know any graphic artists, you know, who also are into that topic that I could recommend. So if there are any in the room, please let me know, or if you know anyone who would be interested in that kind of project. But she contacted me through my website, you know, whatiscompersion.com connection. So there's a lot of people interested in that topic and are on the same page. And in terms of me, I definitely want to publish this as a popular book. Actually, that question came into the audience while you guys were on the conference call. And yes, I definitely don't want that dissertation to sit on the shelf and never look at it again. This is going to be a big part of my life work, and I do want to publish it as a popular book that is going to reflect more of the people who are living those experiences. So thank you so much for validating that and encouraging me in doing that.
Oh. Well, I want to congratulate you again, Doctor, and you know, on all your fine work. It's been a joy to work with you and with your committee, and I learned a lot from your work, and that makes me happy. And I'm really glad we're going to be in touch too about publication and moving forward. So that'll be great too. I'm going to go ahead and at this point stop the recording, and then although I do have to get going, like I mentioned earlier, I'm going to let this run for a while so people can just have conversations. So enjoy the day, and you have to celebrate at the end of it. That's my last assignment for you. So
yes, sir.
Congratulations.
Thank you so much.
Congratulations.